This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'll be taking a look at Sailor Fuji-sugata. I'll be testing it in a variety of pins and nib sizes, ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, and I'll also take a look at a writing sample that's been done on copy paper. I'll compare Sailor Fuji-sugata to a couple other similar inks from my collection, and then I'll take a look at the results of the water resistance test. Fuji-sugata felt a little dry coming off the glass dip nib, but the ink did come off fairly uniformly. I did have to turn the nib a little bit as I wrote. However, in my ink swatch, the ink did come off the tweezers very uniformly, and it grabbed onto the paper and held on to it. There doesn't seem to be a big range from dark to light, so I'm not anticipating this to be an ink that shows a lot of shading, but from this little drip down here, I might see a little halo in the writing sample. It looks like this might be an ink that has a little bit of chromo shading to it. I'm going to begin with my Pilot 78G with the extra fine stainless steel nib. I'm kind of surprised. It didn't feel dry like I was expecting on other writing samples that I've been doing with this pen in particular. It really felt scratchy, but I'm going to put that this was okay. It wasn't unpleasant on this Tomoe River paper. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. Look at the smear. This is definitely a chromo shading ink. The pink stayed behind it, soaked into the paper pretty quickly, and then when you wipe it, it looks like blue ink got wiped away. But this was actually very nice, and again, I was surprised because this ink felt really dry, even in this smooth Custom 74 nib. It felt just really dry and bordering on unpleasant on other papers. But so far, this Tomoe River paper is behaving nicely with this ink. Since this is a Sailor ink, I've got a few Sailor pens coming up next. This is a Sailor Pro Gear Slim with a 14 karat fine nib. Again, not bad. Much better than the writing samples I did on previous papers. Not as nice as the Custom 74, and it's not quite as wet. I'm going to say this is okay. It's definitely better than the Pilot Extra Fine, but not as nice as the Pilot Fine. Next, I've got my Sailor Cool with a medium fine stainless steel nib. A little bit of a hard start there, and yeah, this one feels dry. It's wetter than the extra fine, but I would say it's less pleasant than the extra fine was. I'm gonna just put dry. It feels like I'm writing with a pen with no ink. It feels like I'm writing with a dry nib. Next, I've got a Sailor 1911 Standard with a 14 karat medium nib. This is nice. This is my favorite nib so far, and this nib was nice on the other writing samples. Look how wet it is. It's putting down just a nice, beautiful, legible line, and it's very enjoyable to write with. And I've noticed that with these dry feeling, chromo shading, undersaturated inks, they tend to perform really well in my Sailor medium nib as well as my Platinum 3776 with a medium nib. Something about the shape of the nib, I think the bottom edge of it's kind of flat and it spreads the ink out nice and uniformly, and the nib doesn't glide on the page. There's feedback, but it's just feels really nice. It's unusual that I like a writing experience more than my Pilot Gold nibs, but for these kind of inks, the Sailor 1911 and the Platinum 3776 medium nibs are usually my favorite. Next is my Quebeco Lily Put, and I've been using the double broad replacement nib, but I recently picked up just a broad replacement nib. There's not a lot of difference between the two. I just want to get a little experience with the broad nib and see if there's a noticeable difference. Now, this is the first nib that I've written with that has felt glassy smooth. And yeah, this is very enjoyable. Not super wet, not as wet as the Sailor, but wet enough and broad enough that feels really nice. And finally, I've got my Genhow X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. This is a replacement nib that I got from Anderson Pens, one of their number 6 size replacement nibs. A little bit of a hard start there, and I've noticed that with this ink in this particular nib. I've had a few just minor hard starts. Okay, that was pretty dry. And I've noticed over the course of the writing samples that I did prior to this that this stub nib usually is just a luxurious, really wet writer. But with this ink, I don't know, it's just having trouble conducting the ink through the nib. It's not a very wet writer with this ink. It's behaving similar to my tweezers when I did my tweezer swatch. Okay, while this dries, let's take a look at the copy paper. Now, I didn't enjoy any of the nibs with this copy paper. This is not 20-pound copy paper. This is, I think it's like 24. So, not many inks bleed through it terribly. There's a few spots, and that's just normal bleed through you would have. But the wider nibs, it tended to feather, and the paper just felt mushy when I was writing. And then the finer nibs just felt dry and unpleasant. So I didn't like this ink in any of the nibs on really absorbent paper. Some similar inks that I have in my collection, I don't have many, but Iroshizuku Murasaki Shikibu was a similar color purple. And then Sailor Manyo Neko Yanagi behaves similarly. It's a chromo shading ink, but it's a little bit more pale and it's got a little bit more blue in it. So It behaves like the Neko Yanagi, and it looks like Murasaki Shikibu, but it's got a little more color variation than the Neko Yanagi had. And in my water resistance test, there's not much water resistance. So this is one of those inks that'll mostly wash away. I guess, yeah, in some of the nibs it just nearly completely washed away. So no water resistance. And on the Tomoe River paper, kind of surprising, it looks like almost some bleed through in spots. And I've noticed that in my Leuchtturm, where I do my writing samples with my stub nib, purple inks tend to be more prone to bleed through the Leuchtturm paper. In fact, I think every ink that has ever bled through my Leuchtturm paper was some variation of a purple. So I'm kind of surprised this isn't a very well saturated ink. I guess it's not bleeding through, but it's almost bleeding through. Let's see. I'm not seeing any sheen, but where it's laid down heavy with the glass dip pen, I see like a blue halo, kind of like with the drip where I picked up the tweezers and the swatch. Now, just like on the copy paper, I didn't like any of the pens. On Tomoe River, I liked most of them. Now, the extra fine was just a little bit too fine. You see the legibility of it is not the greatest, but I guess it wouldn't be bad. It would be acceptable to use in a little, like a week's planner, or any of those planners that use good paper but have really small grids, the Japanese planners. So I didn't like the extra fine. The stub was a little bit too dry and just a little too washed out. I guess the Sailor Licool was also felt a little too dry, but the others, I'm surprised. The Pro Gear Slim with the fine nib, it was pleasant, but my favorite was the 1911, and I guess my second favorite was the Custom 74. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.